Greetings. I just want to do a video here, hopefully a fairly brief one, but who knows really, about one of the things that is talked about in Best American Experimental Fiction 2020. A couple of you in your posts commented on it, and so I thought it might be worth kind of exploring a little bit further, especially at the beginning of a course which looks at experimental writing, which we've already talked about the fact that's kind of a loosey-goosey term in itself. What does that mean exactly? And there probably is no exact meaning, but basically some sort of narrative approach that kind of pushes the boundaries on traditional ways of thinking about narrative with conflict and resolution and character development and setting and those kinds of things. And In particular, I wanted to look at one of the comments made by the series editors, Seth Abramson and Jesse Damiani. Probably mispronouncing that, so my apologies. And again, one or two of you drew kind of a line under this yourselves in your posts, but where they talk about the fact that anything the market cannot classify, it cannot sell. Anything it cannot sell, it has no interest in whatsoever. And I wanted to, like I said, I wanted to expand on that a little bit further because I think that a lot of writers, maybe when they're first kind of getting their sea legs beneath them, and learning how to write and publish and all that sort of thing. They have a fairly linear view of how it all is supposed to transpire. And what I mean by that is they maybe imagine that you maybe take some courses, you read a lot, you learn your craft, you learn how to write an interesting story with conflict and resolution, and as I said before, you've got interesting characters, and you learn techniques of dialogue, so that's snappy and interesting, and all those things. And so you get to a point where you can write some short stories that are effective, and they find their way into some maybe little journals, little magazines. But meanwhile, you've gotten your confidence, and so you write your first novel, and you maybe spend years on it, making it as good as it can be. And then you go and find a literary agent, and you get a good one, and they pretty quickly find a publisher for your book. You get your book out there into the world. People read it and love it, and you are on your way. You are doing readings and book signings, and there are fan clubs popping up on Facebook and places like that. Maybe somebody wants to make a movie out of your book. It all just goes according to plan. And for some writers, that does describe pretty well the path that they end up taking, and good for them. I do think, though, that's a rarity. It isn't nearly quite that simple. It isn't nearly quite that straightforward for the vast, vast, vast majority of writers. And I think ultimately a lot of writers have to kind of make a decision. They find themselves in somewhat of a conundrum. And it's not a new conundrum. And in fact, I wanted to pull a bit from this book, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And maybe you are familiar with the letter, or the part of a letter that I'm about to share with you. You may know a little bit about Herman Melville and Moby Dick. Melville, you may be aware, when he was a young man, didn't really know what he wanted to do with himself. He tried all kinds of things, including being a school teacher, being a surveyor. His older brother ran a pretty successful business, and he was welcome to join the firm if he wanted to, but that didn't really appeal to him. And so, not sure what he wanted to do. He did what a lot of young men did in the mid-1800s, and he became a seaman. And he specifically signed on to a whaler named the Acushnet, and he set out on a multi-year whaling expedition, which is what kind of whaling expeditions were in the 1840s. And he had quite an adventure. He had all sorts of things happen during this. I think he was out there maybe 2 or 3 years. I forget exactly, but he was gone a long time. He at one point jumped ship and was kind of held captive by a tribe of cannibals on the Marquesas Islands. Not a terrible ordeal, although he was always afraid of winding up entree at one of their meals. But he was there for quite a while before he was able to get away and get on another ship and get out of there. He eventually was involved in a mutiny in another ship, deposited ultimately in the Hawaiian Islands, and then had to make his way home from there. So he had quite a series of adventures, and he got back to New York. And he still didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, but he now had all these stories. So he wrote his first novel, and it was a highly autobiographical novel titled Taipei, a fictionalized, but in some cases barely fictionalized version of his experience among the cannibals of the Marquesas Islands. Side note, I wrote a revisionist version of Taipei called Weeping with an Ancient God. It was a Chicago Book Review Best Book of 2015. Just saying. But anywho, he wrote Taipei. It was picked up by a publisher very quickly. It was very, very popular. His publisher and the reading public wanted more. So he wrote Omu, which was basically a fictionalized autobiography of his return home after leaving the Marquesas Islands, getting away from them. That was well received, and the publisher wanted more of those same kinds of books. The reading public wanted more, but Melville had a problem. And you may also know that Melville was neighbors with Nathaniel Hawthorne, and they became good friends. Melville really idolized Hawthorne, wrote letters to him frequently, even though, like I said, they lived very close to each other, but still, wrote letters back and forth. For Melville, Hawthorne was sort of his literary soulmate, and he could tell things to him about his writing life, share some of his anxieties and frustrations with a fellow writer who would understand them in a way that no one else in Melville's circle did. I think as writers, a lot of us can relate to that. Maybe you're living with another writer, and so you can kind of share those complexities and anxieties and triumphs, hopefully, and those kinds of things. But on the other hand, a lot of us aren't, that close to another writer, and so maybe that explains some of the popularity of social media, where writers and other kind of artists can find each other online and have some of that connection. But anyway, Melville and Hawthorne wrote letters back and forth quite a bit, and this is the May 1851 letter that Melville wrote to Hawthorne, and he is in the throes of writing what would become Moby Dick. And he was really struggling with the text. He was trying to write a very, very unusual, groundbreaking kind of novel. And he writes in this letter, "In a week or so, I go to New York to bury myself in a third-story room and work and slave on my whale," quote unquote. That, he says, is the only way I can finish it now. He goes a bit further and he says, "Dollars damn me. My dear sir, a presentiment is on me. I shall at last be worn out and perish like an old nutmeg grater grated to pieces. What I feel most moved to write, that is banned. It will not pay. Yet altogether write the other way I cannot. So the product is a final hash, and all my books are botches." So the conundrum that Melville found himself in, his publisher and the reading public wanted more Taipei, more Omu, more of that pretty just straightforward travel log, page turner kind of adventure story. And if he just kept writing those, financially he would be just fine. The money would keep rolling in, but he was bored to tears, with that. He didn't want to write that kind of book. He had this other idea, this kind of burning desire to write this other kind of book. And so he did. He abandoned the kind of writing that he knew to be successful and financially, valuable, etc. And he wrote Moby Dick. He did get it published, right away, both in England and in the U.S., and it was pretty much a failure. People just didn't know what to do with it. I don't know if you've read Moby Dick. I hope you have. If you haven't, add it to your list. But it's just got all sorts of strange stuff happening in it. I mean, it's this adventure tale about this group of whalers who are out to hunt this one particular whale because of Captain Ahab's obsession. But there's a lot of just very detailed information about whaling, how you go about it, how the industry works. There's a lot of scientific information about whales and different kinds of whales and how they're related to each other, and on and on and on. At certain points in the narrative, the seamen will break into song, and so there's lyrics included in the text, and just all kinds of strange things happening. Well, the reading public, like I said, really didn't know what to do with it. It pretty much ended Melville's commercial career as a writer. After that, he didn't really have any other successes. He continued to write until his dying day. He lived to be a fairly ripe age for the time period. But he ended up becoming a civil servant. That's how he was able to support himself and his family. And yet again, he continued to write. He wrote poetry. He wrote short stories, some of which brought in some money, but not nearly enough to support himself and his family. And he wrote other, novellas and so forth and so on. But he went to his grave thinking he was pretty much a failure as a writer. But as we know, looking back, he was just ahead of his time. The 1920s rolled around. The movie industry was a fledgling thing. They were looking around for books to turn into movie scripts, and somebody found this weird book called Moby Dick and thought it would make a good silent film. And so it was adapted for the big screen, or fairly big screen comparatively. And I don't know if the movie was that popular, but it reminded the world that there was this book called Moby Dick. Again, this is the 1920s, the age of modernism, James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, T.S. Eliot, etc. And when it was read in that context, people saw that it was a masterpiece. It was just this genius work of art. Melville was doing things in the 1850s other writers would even try to do until 70 years later, and since then it's been kind of a staple of American literature. But again, Melville was in this dilemma. He knew how to write to be popular and to make money, and he knew how to write to make himself happy as a literary artist. And those two things he hoped would jibe, but they didn't. Not in the 1850s. And so he chose to be a literary artist, and to give up writing the kinds of books that made him money but didn't make him happy. And again, he expresses that dilemma in the 1850s, but he was certainly not the first to feel that way, and definitely not the last to feel that way. I think a lot of writers today have to make similar kinds of choices. because I think even more so today than 150 years ago, um, writers can either write for popularity and to hopefully bring in some money, or they can write work that they just find artistically pleasing. It's complex, it's innovative. They have things they want to say that a very small slice of the reading population may want to read, but that is what they're driven to write. Wanted to share kind of along those lines a little bit from my literary idol, William H. Gass. And Gass kind of famously, at least famous in certain circles, um, said in 1971, when he was still pretty newly working on the novel he called The Tunnel, which he didn't know it at the time, but it would end up taking him 26 years to write. It wasn't published until 1995. But in 1971, in an interview, he said that his hope was, he was being sort of flippant, but his hope was that the book turned out to be so good, no one would publish it. And what he was getting at was that there was this kind of inverse correlation between the quality of the writing and the likelihood of it finding a publisher. Now, it ultimately was published. It won the American Book Award, etc. But it was not well received across the board by critics, and it has not been read a lot in the last 26 years. Fun fact: November 1st, there's going to be the beginning of a group reading of The Tunnel, kind of organized through Discord.com. But if you go to Twitter or Discord or Instagram and you put in the hashtag Gas21, you will link to that. And I highly recommend getting involved with reading The Tunnel and doing it as a group read, especially. But anyway, Gass, writing in the preface to the republication of In the Heart of the Country, his collection of novellas and short stories, he writes, the contemporary American writer is in no way a part of the social and political scene. He is therefore not muzzled, for no one fears his bite, nor is he called upon to compose. Whatever work he does must proceed from a reckless inner need. The world does not beckon, nor does it greatly reward. This is not a boast or a complaint. It is a fact. Serious writing must nowadays be written for the sake of the art. The condition I describe is not extraordinary. Certain scientists, philosophers, historians, and many mathematicians do the same, advancing their causes as they can. One must be satisfied with that. So let me go back to one particular line. Whatever work he does must proceed from a reckless inner need. In other words, he's got this burning desire, he, she, they, this burning desire to write, and knowing full well that there's not a huge reading public that is chomping at the bit to get hold of it. No one's going to, line up outside of Barnes and Noble, waiting for the doors to open on the day that the book is released to get their copy. And in fact, maybe it won't find a publisher at all. But yet they feel the need to write, and to write a particular, way, a particular message, and so on. And, hopefully a writer can merge those worlds. And there have been writers who have been able to do that. A writer that comes to mind is Kurt Vonnegut. He, on the one hand, was sort of the epitome of the metafictional postmodern author. His books, Slaughterhouse-Five, Breakfast of Champions, and so on, were very, very edgy the way that he put them together. Again, I don't know how familiar you are with those books in particular, or Vonnegut in general. But Slaughterhouse-Five is sort of this hybrid autobiographical, narrative about his experience during World War II and being a prisoner of war. But then it's also this weird science fiction story, and it kind of morphs back and forth between the two, and that kind of thing. Um, and Vonnegut became very, very popular. Obviously, understatement there. And so his ability to push the boundaries of what narrative can be and be a bestseller and make money and be, kind of almost universally respected. I say almost universally. For some reason, Gass wasn't much of a Vonnegut fan. Not him as a person, but his writing. Another author that comes to mind is Toni Morrison. Her novels, Beloved, Song of Solomon, Jazz, on and on. Very, very edgy, very much pushing the boundaries of how stories can be told and so forth. I used to teach Beloved consistently in another university I used to teach in their adult ed program, and I love that novel. And again, very, very complex, and not just the subject matter, that's true, and not just the characters, that's true, but the way that she tells the story, very, very complex, difficult to follow at times. And not everyone on the first time through completely gets what's going on. But a great book. And just a little side note here, I teach Toni Morrison's shorter novel, novella, whatever you might want to call it, called Home, in my long story and novellas course. And Home by Toni Morrison is a revision of Homer's Odyssey. And I think a little bit of the Iliad is tucked in there as well. But as I said, I could teach it in my revisionist fictions course because it is that too. But it's a great little book, little novella, short novel. But again, pushing the boundaries there, in terms of writing a novel set in the 1950s in the South, but pulling in a lot of those Homeric features, particularly of the Odyssey, and I think also of the Iliad. So experimenting in that way there. So anyway, there have been writers who have found the ability to do both, but both of those writers, Vonnegut and Morrison, I would throw Faulkner in that group too. Very forward thinking, very risk taking narratively, but found success, including commercial success in his day. But that's a much earlier time. I think it's much, much harder today to be both artistically daring and popular. For one thing, there are only a handful of commercial publishers left in the U.S. It seems like there's a lot more, but for the last 20 to 30 years, the larger companies have been buying up the smaller ones, and all the ones that exist now are arms of entertainment industries, and so they have to make money, and the only way to make money is to kind of aim for that middle group of readers. Obviously, the number of readers that there are total, keeps shrinking, shrinking, shrinking over time. With streaming services and video games and just all kinds of other forms of entertainment available. The number of people who just read for fun, it just keeps getting fewer and fewer and fewer. And certainly the number of people who read really challenging material that really kind of makes you think and maybe makes you reread, a passage a few times before you even quite know what's going on. That segment of the reading population is always been smaller, and it just keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so, so if you're going to be popular, if you're going to have a lot of readers, if you're going to find an agent, if you're going to, if that agent is going to find one of these few commercial publishers that remain, you're going to have to be targeting that big middle chunk of readers, the readers who are, reading kind of middle of the road material in terms of it's easy to follow, it's kind of page turning, it's provocative, the characters are interesting, but they're not difficult to sort of figure out or whatever. And I'm not trying to put that kind of writing down. That is a skill set, and there are writers who have that skill set, and they have learned how to do that. They have learned how to write stories that a lot of readers are going to like and appreciate, and good for them. Other writers just don't have that skill set. They don't have the desire to have that skill set, um, and so it's kind of two different worlds. I think if we go into Barnes and Noble, the only remaining bookseller left, brick and mortar bookseller left, really. I mean, in larger cities you can find you know uh, still independent bookstores and the like, but nationally and so on, Barnes and Noble is pretty much it. But if we go in there and look at the bookshelves, maybe even just specifically in kind of the fiction area, we probably just say, oh, well, this is the best of the best. These are the people who have agents, and they've found, commercial publishers who can get them, on the get them shelf space in a place like Barnes and Noble. And so the writers must be the creme de la creme. Not necessarily. They're writers who have found a way to write stuff that quite a few people like and want to read. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the most innovative, most interesting, most provocative, most intellectually stimulating writers on the planet. Those writers don't find shelf space at Barnes and Noble. Um, and again, it's a numbers game. Like I said, the book business has increasingly become a business, and books are expected by those kind of publishers to make money. Literary agents are not a charity. They're trying to make money for themselves and their agencies. So they're only going to take on writers and books by writers that they think they can sell. So they're not going to take on a writer or a project just because they have some deep love for it and just want to get it out there in the world. I mean, I suppose it happens sometimes. I'm not saying it never happens, but pretty much. I mean, but agents are trying to make money, and the only way they're going to make money is to take on projects that they can sell to commercial publishers. And again, there's only about 5 of them left in the U.S. And so on. Um, Nevertheless, I know a lot of people want to go that route. I've had a couple of agents during my writing life. One was an East Coast agent, the other was a West Coast agent. Neither one of them ultimately did much for me in my writing career, and that's not unusual. Um, and that's something else to think about. And another reason why a lot of writers have just kind of frankly given up on that path. Um, Again, if you find an agent and you jibe and they can get your book with the kind of press you want to publish with, that's fantastic. But it's not, again, quite so simple for most writers. For one thing, even finding an agent is a really can be a really tricky, difficult, and sort of exhausting and dispiriting, humbling sort of experience. Um, you obviously want to research you know agents who claim to be looking for the sort of thing that you've written and you're trying to find a publisher for. And quite honestly, for me, that was a problem from the start, because I would always have kind of trouble describing what it is I've written. And, again, it goes back to that original quote about how, the market wants to tuck it into kind of neatly labeled little pigeonholes. It's a Western, it's a romance, it's a cozy mystery, it's chick lit, whatever it is. But anyway, you look for an agent who says they represent the kinds of thing you think you've written. Um, but then it's not just a matter. Oh, I'll just contact them. Every agent, every agency has a somewhat different approach. If you are a short story writer or a poet and you're submitting to magazines, pretty much every magazine has essentially the same format they're looking for. Yeah, there's a little bit of variety, but pretty much, however you just send them the thing, you send them the story, or you send them a batch of poems, and a little kind of a cover letter, usually within submittable or whatever, or maybe as an email or whatever it is, and that's that. But submitting books is a whole different ballgame, because there's just all kinds of variables. Some agents say submit just to them. So even though there's multiple agents within the agency, they specifically say don't send the same query to two or three different agents within the same agency. Just pick one and just submit it to that person. Others say, yeah, go ahead, and maybe there's 5 agents in this agency, and it's fine to send the same query to 2 or 3 agents within the same agency. They don't communicate, and one may like it, one may not. But again, some are okay with that, some not. Some don't have you submit to an agent at all. They have sort of a generic, query, email address, or they have some sort of online formatting thing. So you just send it to that, and then somebody decides if they want to move it along to somebody else. Some agents or agencies want the whole enchilada. They want the whole novel sent to them if they're going to take a look at it, but a lot of them not. But again, it varies. Some want like the first chapter. Some want like the first 3 chapters. Some want the first 25 pages. Some want the first 50 pages. Some want the first 50 pages and a 1-page summary of the entire book. Some want the first chapter and a 1-page summary. Some want a chapter by chapter detailed outline of the entire novel in addition to the first 2 chapters. Whatever it is. It's just so you got to read the guidelines, and they're all idiosyncratic. And obviously, one of the best ways to shoot yourself in the foot and get off to a really bad start with an agent is to not follow their guidelines to the letter. So you got to be really, really careful. Make sure you're sending them exactly what they want and not sending them what they don't want. And obviously, you need to keep track of all that. A lot of agents now tell you up front they aren't going to respond to your query unless they're interested. So if a few months goes by and you haven't heard from them, you can just assume it's a no. But there's that sort of, that's sort of unsettling too as a writer. Maybe you want to say, well, I'll send out a dozen queries and then I'll wait maybe to hear back from all of them before I go through this laborious, soul crushing process again. But then how long do you wait? 3 months, 4 months, and that's become 6 months. So you wait and you wait and you wait. Well, then maybe you hear back from them, and maybe, okay, they're a little bit interested, so send them more. Maybe now they want the whole manuscript. Maybe they want more of the manuscript. And so you obviously eagerly and happily send them more. And so then you wait another few months perhaps. And maybe they say no. Maybe they say, yeah, we'd like to represent this. So you think, okay, cool. Well, again, that doesn't necessarily end the anxiety there, because oftentimes agents will want revisions and before they send it out to publishers. And so they want you to do X, Y, or Z with it, make it longer, make it shorter, build up this character, take out that character. Some agents, are more sort of proactive in that way than others. So maybe you have to do a few rewrites for your agent. I have a friend who landed a really big time agent with a New York agency, and I could list several of the authors that this agent represents. You'd be pretty impressed. I was, so was my friend, and she was through the roof that this agent was willing to take her and her book on. But the agent kept asking for more revisions and more revisions. Finally, I think it was like 2.5 years that she'd been working with this agent, and they still hadn't submitted her book to a publisher. So she withdrew it and just kind of gave up. So anyway, there's that. And then let's say the agent finds you a publisher. It could take months, it could take years to find a publisher. because publishers take a long time to get back. They hem and haw. They're not sure. They might want to see more, whatever. But let's say that you get a contract with a one of these big publishers. Then you get assigned an editor. Maybe you click with the editor. Maybe you don't. Maybe they seem to understand what you're trying to do. Maybe they don't. They want revisions. They want you to cut stuff, to add stuff, to change this, to change that. So you work with that editor. Maybe the manuscript finally, after several months or several years, gets to a point where they feel like it's ready to be published. Oh, by the way, your editor got a better job at a different publishing company, and so now you've been assigned a new editor after a year or 6 months or 2 years or whatever it is. Then the graphic design people get involved, and they start designing your book and start doing the book cover, and it clearly has nothing to do with what the book is about, because they're graphic artists and they haven't read the book, or maybe not past the first chapter, so they just don't know what it's about. So there's that. Well, not really the cover I had in mind. It doesn't really say anything about the book, but it'll sell books, so that's the important thing. So anyway, then you go through all that. Maybe the book finally gets out there, and maybe people read it. Probably they don't, in mass anyway. I'm among other things, I'm a librarian, and one of my favorite things every week to do when I work at the library is to go to the new book case and see what books have arrived in the last few days, because every week we have a few new books. And for one thing, there's just a sameness about them. They just, you look at them and it's like, well, this book looks like 50 other books, on the same shelf practically. And most of them sit there, not read at all, and again, the better the book, the more complex, the more interesting, the edgier, the less likely it is that anyone's going to pick it up and actually read it. They want the fourth James Patterson book that's come out this week. They want Daniel Steele. They want Stephen King. They want Nora Roberts. They want, the same author they've read again and again and again. Don't quote me on this, but because it varies a little bit year to year, but we've kind of got to a point where about 24 or so authors account for about 85% of the book sales in the U.S. in terms of fiction, that kind of thing. Again, about 24 or so account for about 85% of the book sales, which means the other thousands and thousands and thousands of us are competing for that 15% of readers. And again, most of that 15% want things that are pretty easy to read, that are pretty predictable, that they are going to pick up and they can read without struggling through the text and that kind of thing. So anyway, that model I described of, you learn your craft, you write a book, you get an agent, you get a publisher, you get a fan club, you get a movie deal. Yes, for some writers, and I have some friends for whom that has happened, and good for them. I'm happy for them. But the vast, vast majority of us, that does not describe our writing lives. And so where I'm kind of going with all this is, so like I said, there's kind of these two different camps that kind of develop, and they kind of go back to that Melville conundrum. There are writers who decide that they want to write for popularity. They want to write for a large readership. They want to make some money, and so they're going to target their writing for that. Then there are writers who decide, yeah, I'd love to have a bunch of readers. I'd love to make some money. I'm human. But at the same time, writing is hard. It's hard work. It's time consuming. And my heart has to be in it. I have to love what I'm writing, and I have to really be stimulated by it intellectually and emotionally. And if that means not writing for a mass audience, well, so be it. I'll write what makes me happy. If I can find a few readers out there, that's great. Because I think that's an important question to think about too. How many readers do you have to justify the writing of a book? If a book's justification has to be, well, it's had 5,000 readers or 100,000 readers or 500 readers, well, that could be a steep climb for a lot of writers, even the 500. But if it touches one person, five people, and it's meaningful for them, is that enough? Is that enough? Or if it only is just something that you've done for yourself and you are satisfied with it, it's made you happy to make it, to produce it, to write it, is that enough? Right? Um, and I think for the writers who are motivated by, they need to have an audience. They need to have a bunch of people buying their books and money rolling in and an agent, encouraging them and an editor encouraging them. Um, if they don't have that, it's very easy to just kind of give up. Um, my mentor when I was working on my MA, I got an MA. It was like an MFA, but the university wasn't accredited for MFA yet, so I can't put the F between the M and the A. But it was like an MFA, and my mentor Kent Harif, terrific writer and an even better person, or let's say equally good person, terrific person and writer all around. But he used to tell us, and it sounds kind of mean, and Ken was not mean at all. Um, but he used to say, the world doesn't need another story. And I guess he could have gone on to say it doesn't need another poem, it doesn't need another movie, it doesn't need another song. And he wasn't trying to belittle us or discourage us, but what he was trying to get across was no one is going to be beating our door down for our short story or a novel or a poem or a collection of poems or you name it. There's plenty of them out there. And nobody is going to be wanting us to write that book. In fact, the world pretty much conspires against us. Like I said, some of us maybe are married to partners who understand, who get it, and who want to be supportive and give us the space we need to do our thing. A lot of people not, or at least not fully. And of course, a lot of people have other responsibilities. They have jobs that they have to work at to bring in money, of course. They maybe have small children, or they have to take care of, or maybe later in life they have parents they have to take care of. And people are vying for our time. If you have kids in school, then obviously there's practices and recitals and lessons and homework to supervise and to help with and cupcakes to bake for the bake sale, and it just goes on and on and on. And so for most of us, our writing is sort of forced further and further and further down the priority list, not because it isn't important to us, it just isn't important to the world. And so they're not really giving us the space and the time to really write it. And one of the ways I dealt with that, I raised three boys and worked multiple jobs, as I still do. And I just started getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Fortunately, I'm a fairly early riser naturally anyway, but five still, a lot of mornings that was not a welcome sound, the alarm going off. But I got up, I walked the dogs. And when the kids were little, I got their breakfasts together, I got their lunches packed, I got them up and dressed and all that stuff. So in order for me to have any time at all to write during the day, I had to get up at 5. And that with that I could squeeze out 30 or 40 minutes in the morning to write. And I got in the habit of that and have done that now for 30 some years. Obviously the kids are long out of the house and I don't have to get up that early to fit my writing in. I still prefer to write in the morning nevertheless. But again, that was the only way to do it. 30 or 40 minutes a day, Monday through Friday pretty much. Now it doesn't sound like much, but if you think about it, 30 to 40 minutes a day, by the end of the week, you're looking at 2.5 hours of writing. By the end of the month, you can be looking at, 40 some hours or whatever it might be. And it builds up. over time, you can write a whole novel or a whole screenplay or a whole collection of poems or whatever it is your target is. But again, there's nobody knocking on your door to see where it's at. Um, a lot of people have this phenomenon who go through an MFA program where while they're in the program, they can continue to produce work because they've got instructors that are giving them deadlines, and they've got instructors and classmates who are giving them hopefully positive feedback, and so that's spurring them on. But once they graduate, they get their degree and they get out there into the real world, whatever that is. There's nobody prodding them along. In fact, like I said, most people don't have people, not only don't have them prodding them along, they have them, kind of conspiring against them. And so a lot of people don't end up writing much of anything after their MFA, particularly once they maybe start down that path of trying to get an agent, trying to get a publisher. And again, for most of us, they discover how difficult and dispiriting that is. And it's like, why am I doing this? I could join a bowling league. I could join a book club. I could be doing something with my life that I find much more fulfilling than toiling away, putting words on a page that nobody seems to want to read anyway. But then again, that's where we get back to Gass's inner need. You just feel that need to write, whether anyone's going to publish it, whether anyone's going to read it once it's published, etc. Well, this video has gone on a lot longer than I thought it might, so my apologies for that. Feel free to watch it in chunks or whatever. I would like you though to respond a little bit. Maybe not much. Briefly is fine, but anything I've kind of talked about, and certainly if you disagree or have questions or concerns or whatever based on my ramblings here, feel free to post that in the announcements section in that thread, and we will certainly hopefully have a nice dialogue. But thanks for watching and listening.